Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.
Welcome to the Safer Chemicals Podcast. My name is Päivi Jokiniemi. As the June meeting of our Biocidal Products Committee has ended, it's now time to go through the most interesting topics that the committee discussed. The chair of the committee, Erik van der Plassche, is here to give us the highlights. So welcome, Erik. Thanks for joining us again.
Hi, Päivi. Good to be here. Good to see you.
Before we go into the details of the June meeting, perhaps you could briefly just explain what's the role and the main tasks of the committee.
Yeah, the role of the Biocidal Products Committee, which is one of the committees within the agency, is to adopt opinions on different processes within the Biocidal Products Regulation. And the most important ones in that respect is the active substance approval process and Union Authorisations, where we adopt opinions on whether an active substance can be approved or whether an authorization for a biocidal product can be granted. This opinion is forwarded to the European Commission, and they have to take a decision in the end on what happens in both of these situations. And almost all of the member states are represented within the committee. We only miss Bulgaria. And when you talk about, let's say other people who are present, we have stakeholders. We have, of course, the applicant for a dossier who is present, and the commission is present as an observer. So those, in fact, are our main tasks and is our role.
Thanks, Erik. Good to have this summary of your tasks. In this meeting now in June, you adopted a record number of opinions. Mm-hmm. So altogether 9 opinions on Union Authorisations and 5 concerning active substance applications. What if we start with the Union Authorisations?
Yeah, maybe to say a few words about most of them. Several we adopted quite quickly. For example, for a couple of products who are based on lactic acid. One which was based on peracetic acid, where that is quite, let's say, becoming quite normal. That for biocidal products, which you have already seen several times before, similar applications, similar uses, similar use patterns, we are able to adopt these opinions quite quick. So that's, I must say, a good thing to see, that we're starting to become more and more efficient when it comes to Union Authorization. We had, for the first time, 2 biocidal products which are based on lines. Never seen that before. For product type 2 and 3, these are used as disinfectants. And these are bulk products. For example, they're used to disinfect sewage sludge. They are used to disinfect manure in farms. Were approved or were authorized, or a proposal to authorize. But the first time we saw those, and these went through. We had 1 Union Authorization based on chlorine gas, which is used to disinfect swimming pools and drinking water. We saw a similar application already before, but then we couldn't come to an agreement on the disinfection for swimming pools. But this time we could, as now there was a complete data package when it comes to the efficacy. And I think that's very good that we, propose to authorize this product, at least that it went through, because this is a very important application, as you may know, in swimming pool disinfection and in drinking water. There was 1 Union Authorization where we proposed not to authorize the biocidal product, and that is one which is based on hydrogen peroxide. And it's not so much that hydrogen peroxide is an active substance which is not efficacious, it doesn't work, but it was not authorized for different reasons. And in this case, we're talking about a toilet bowl disinfection, where due to the application of the biocidal product, measures needed to be taken to prevent exposure of either people who are working with it, or people are let's say, coming back or re-entry in the toilet room, which needs to be disinfected, which can be in hospitals or wherever, let's say. The product could only be used safe for professionals if a gas mask could be worn by professionals. And when it comes to the application of it, so you first have to apply it, then you would need to wait for an hour, you would need to flush the toilet, then you would need to wait another hour, and only at that point of time people could start using the toilet again. So that was considered quite, let's say, quite impractical, not very feasible to apply these kind of mitigation measures. There was not, let's say, a complete agreement within the committee. Some said that in theory you can apply these measures, and in the end it would be, let's say, up to the market, up to the applicant to see whether they would still place this product on the market, whether people would buy it and implement these kind of measures, which quite in the end might be quite complex. So, in fact, the question is then, can we ban a certain product simply because of mitigation measures are not very comfortable for the one who's working with the product? But in the end, there was a majority to agree on that this mitigation measure is not practical, it's not feasible, and because of this reason, we cannot implement it, and then the product cannot be used in a safe way. There were other reasons for not granting the authorization. For the first time, we saw that there is a substance of concern, so not the active itself, but one of the coformulants, which had to be assessed and led to environmental risks which cannot be mitigated. So in the end, several reasons for not granting the authorization for this product based on hydrogen peroxide, and that in the end, I think, which will go through and the Commission will take its decision on it. Yeah, and maybe the last one, and it's a bit of a combination where I can tell a bit about, is a wood preservative. Again, the first time, like for the limes, the first time we had this type of product within our framework. We never dealt with Union Authorisation of wood preservatives applications. There are many national authorizations, but not that many on a union basis. This one is based on IPBC, that's the active substance containing iodine. And it's a wood preservative which is used for vacuum pressure impregnation. You may dip the wood for professionals and non-professionals. And non-professionals, they would use it by brushing and rolling. And the issue around here was that we have what is called a single product application. So you can either have a family or a single biocidal product. And in this case, it was a single product. And the issue was, and we had the same for the limes, where you have this single product with two what is called formulation types. Maybe to explain first in simple terms, you might have a liquid, or you might have a solid, or you might have a gas. These are, let's call it in simple terms, formulation types. And when you have a single product, in principle, it cannot be two formulation types. You cannot sell a liquid and a solid in one single package. So normally we would have then either two biocidal products, or you would go to a family, and then you can split it in two parts of the family, and then one would be the solid and the other one would be the liquid. Now in this case we had two formulation types, but in this case it was based on the fact that you have a certain concentrate which you would need to dilute before you can apply it. And that was for the wood preservative only for the vacuum pressure impregnation, that you would need to dilute your concentrate before you can apply it on the wood. And then a bit the theoretical, I must say, question was, then can we still have these two formulation types in one single biocidal product application? And in the end, we discussed quite a long time on both situations, where we applied, let's say, a kind of a principle that as long as what you place on the market is the same, so in this case you either have the concentrate which is placed on the market, and for the lime you would have the powder, and you would only need to dilute it in water, then we can accept such a thing in one single biocidal product application. as long as it's efficacious, of course, as long as the risks are covered, so for human health and for environment, and as long as some of the, let's say, the characteristics in terms of physical chemical properties of the product are respected, let's say. We do not like to see this kind of situations. We would prefer that in the future, when companies come forward with such a kind of a product, please do it in a family. But if you don't, let's say, then look at this principle that at least the what is placed on the market should be the same. And then it would in theory be possible in a single biocidal product application. But preference is in the end that you apply then as a family. So that's what we had in terms of union authorization. So I said in total 9 went through. 1 we could not adopt. We will go for a written procedure and then we assume that we can still adopt it. But that was really the majority of the meeting we had over the last 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. But it really sounds like that it was a mix of familiar cases and something that was quite new that you haven't seen before. Yeah. Great. If we then move on to the active substance applications. So there were 5 opinions this time, but they were all for one and same active substance, formic acid.
Yeah.
Yes. So you supported the use of this active substance for all the 5 product types.
Yeah, we supported the use indeed for mostly as a disinfectant, formic acid, which is a very simple molecule. I guess most of us even would know it from their, let's say, secondary school when they looked into chemistry. But indeed, recommended for approval for PT 2 to 5, and then also to be used as an in-can preservative, where we had one minority opinion, but in the end, indeed, the committee considered that this substance can be approved. There was one issue which might be interesting for our audience, and in fact, it's the same issue which we also had for one of the union authorization applications, and that is that the use of formic acid, and for union authorization, it was the use of chlorocresol, which is contained in a biocidal product, might lead to residues in food, and that can be the use in food processing industries, or it can be the use in product type 3, for example, disinfection of stables or disinfection of equipment by dipping. And the issue around here is that these 2 substances, they have been used in the past as a pesticide, but they are no longer used as a pesticide. And what then happens, and that's the same as for a biocide, when it's not defended anymore, then a so-called non-approval decision is taken by the European Commission. And for substances used as a pesticide, this means that when you look at residues in food, that the so-called default maximum residue limit will apply. And the maximum residue limit, or an MRL, is an important instrument in guaranteeing the safety of our food. And within biocides, we cannot derive such a value, but we need such a value when it comes to substances which might lead to residues in food. Now, I said in this case, there was a non-approval under pesticides, and that means that the so-called default MRL applies. And this default MRL is very low. It's based on the detection limit of a substance, and it's 0.01 micrograms per kilogram. What happened for chlorocresol, and we think that in future the same might apply for formic acid when we start having product authorizations. We would need to take a look at whether this default MRL can be exceeded or not. And there is quite a, let's say, debate ongoing within the Commission, with member states on several questions. And one of them is, does this default MRL apply? And the answer we have so far is yes, it does. So that means that we have to take it into account when we start to authorize products. The other one is, can we not grant an authorization when such a value is exceeded? And that might seem strange because in principle an MRL value should not be exceeded. But in this case, as we work with a default, which is not based on toxicological data or on residue data we have in food, then you might argue that, well, maybe we go a bit too far, let's say, if we do not grant an authorization based on the exceedance of an MRL, which can be based on model calculations, by the way. So at this point of time, the position of the Commission would be that it goes too far to not grant an authorization when this default MRL is exceeded. And that's what we saw for the chlorocresol biocidal product Union Authorization application. So we will not recommend non-authorization for this use. We will proceed with this to the Commission, and then in the end still the Commission would have to take a decision. And then the last thing is that, well, we have that default MRL, but there might be a need, or I would say there is really a need to come up with let's call it then a real MRL, not a default one, but one which is based on, as I said, toxicological data and residue data, which might then be different from the default one. You would expect in general, for sure, for these two substances, that the MRL which will be valid in the end is a bit higher. And for formic acid, the complicating situation is also that formic acid does occur naturally in food and feed. So we do expect that there will be an exceedance of this value. So yeah, overall, again, a complex issue. It doesn't hamper the approval of formic acid, but it will be relevant when product authorizations start coming in.
Something to follow also then in the future.
Yeah, for sure,
yes.
For applicants who are interested in products for formic acid. Yeah.
Maybe in one of the coming episodes we will be talking about this again then.
I guess so, yeah.
And then this time you also had several requests from the European Commission. One of these was about the availability and suitability of alternatives to hexaflumuron for termite control. And this before the renewal of approval process for the substance can start.
We discussed it already at the last meeting, a draft opinion, and now we had the revised one, where this opinion was prepared by the Greek authorities. And now we managed to approve or to adopt this opinion. Its background is the following, that well, hexaflumuron is coming up for renewal. It's a substance which is meeting the exclusion criteria. So it's meeting the PBT criteria. It's even a very persistent and very bioaccumulative substance. So that means that in principle it cannot be renewed unless one of the conditions for derogation is met. And it's used as an insecticide for termite control. And termites are let's say nasty animals. They're not in the where we live in Finland, but they are for sure causing a lot of issues in the southern part of Europe, but also in overseas areas, when talking about France, but also, for example, the Canary Islands from Spain. So we had some information even from termite control in the Canary Islands, which was quite relevant for our discussions and this opinion. And the reason why we are looking at alternatives for hexaflumuron, or for this case, where it's meeting exclusion, is that there is this idea that we might speed up the renewal of such a substance, which is meeting the exclusion criteria, by looking at alternatives. Because if there are alternatives for all of the uses for which the substance is applied, then the Commission, and this is the Standing Committee, would be able to conclude that as there are alternatives, we can ban the active substance. And that would mean that you do not need to work when it comes to the risk assessment, doing an assessment of the ED properties, which has not been done for hexaflumuron. So it's an idea to speed up the process, which would then in fact only work when there are alternatives for all of the uses. And this is the second time we do this. We did this also for the borates, and now we do it for hexaflumuron. Like for the borates, also for hexaflumuron, we could not conclude that we have alternatives for all the different uses. You have tropical termites and you have subterranean termites. So these are, you see them in the southern part of Europe. And the tropical, of course, you see in the overseas areas from France. And for both cases, hexaflumuron is used. And there are indeed alternatives. Many of them are not suitable, but one of them was suitable, and that is a substance which is called diflubenzuron. But diflubenzuron is only a suitable alternative when it comes to the subterranean termites. It's a substance which is already approved and authorized, and it's not authorized for tropical termites. It might be in the future. Let's say there is in fact no information, but that's the reason why we cannot conclude that we have alternatives for the full use pattern for hexaflumuron. And we discussed a bit also whether diflubenzuron is better or is not better than hexaflumuron. There was some different views around the table. There was information that there are certain disadvantages when it comes to using diflubenzuron. That in the end is not so relevant for this question. We really had to answer the question whether there are suitable alternatives. And as I said, there are only for one of these species there is this diflubenzuron alternative. So it will now go to the Commission, and they would have to see what to do with this opinion.
But does it mean then that there could be a ban for one of these species, so to say, but then that the use could continue for the other?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and that's something indeed we discussed. That can it then be in the end that you would ban indeed hexaflumuron for subterranean termites and not for tropical termite control? It was a conclusion which was already drawn by some of the member states. Although there were also some who were saying, well, we also have situations where both the tropical termite and the subterranean termite is there. And then if you start to ban then it only for the subterranean termite, you would need in fact two biocides to combat this pest. And that's why I think it was France who was arguing, well, we would think it would still be better to have it for both species than on the market. But that's then more a regulatory discussion and conclusion. So that really needs to be taken at the standing committee level. But in that sense, indeed, I'm not sure or convinced whether indeed this will lead to a ban of one of the species.
Okay, all right. You also had another request from the Commission, and that was about formaldehyde releasers and endocrine disrupting.
Yeah.
What could you tell about this discussion?
Yeah, this is an opinion request we received quite some time ago from the European Commission. And these were active substances where there was already an opinion adopted by us, but then the ED criteria started to enter into application, and that these opinions came back where we had to assess the ED properties of these active substances. And in this case, indeed, we're dealing with formaldehyde releasers. There are many within our program. And in this case, we dealt with two. Most simple is to use the abbreviations MBO and HPT. And we have 9 opinions where this has to be done, let's say. And the evaluating CA, in this case, it's Austria who performed the ED assessment. And it's quite relevant because all formaldehyde releases and formaldehyde itself, because you're looking at formaldehyde, in fact, you're not so much looking at the releaser. These will be impacted, let's say, by this decision. If we take a decision like this for MBO and HPT, the same decision can be taken for the whole class of the whole group. In fact, we cannot conclude that formaldehyde meets the criteria, in a sense that it's very difficult to test. Maybe that's the most simple way to say it. There are substances where there are technical challenges to test whether the substance is meeting the criteria. In fact, it's doing, whether the test would be feasible to carry out. And in this case, for formaldehyde, there are really technical challenges to perform such a test. And the working groups, the experts on human health and environment concluded that there are, let's say, challenges which are very difficult at this point of time to overcome. We will not ask at this point of time to ask for further information. Let's then conclude that at this point of time we cannot conclude that formaldehyde is meeting the criteria or not. Then that's the way the dossier would have to proceed. And of course, formaldehyde releases are already meeting the exclusion criteria. So in that sense, there is some regulatory impact, but it will not change the exclusion criterion. There was one interesting debate we had, and that came from a proposer from Sweden who said, well, we do not know whether it meets the ED criteria. In theory, we might be able to do some further testing, even though we realize that there are these challenges. Would it then not be better to impose certain conditions on the approval to minimize exposure as much as possible? Over there were quite some different views again around the table. The majority having no sympathy, in fact, for such a measure. Most members said, well, exclusion, that's a reason for not for minimizing exposure as much as possible. But the fact that we cannot conclude, even though it's a very important property, of course, it's one of the exclusion properties, we would not go as far to minimize exposure, which would mean you would need to work in closed systems, etc., etc. And there might also be situations where a substance is not meeting exclusion, but simply because of its properties, highly reactive substances, for example, would we then also impose such a strict condition? Goes a bit too far according to the majority. But I think it was an interesting point which was raised by Sweden, and I guess again it's not the last time that we will discuss it, or where it would not become a topic which will be discussed at the standing committee level, because it's also a bit of a, let's say, a regulatory issue, a policy issue. But to come back, no conclusion on ED properties, and it will be having an effect on the whole class of substances.
Okay, important opinion from that point of view.
Yeah.
As the last topic, I thought maybe we could just have a short discussion about the work program and what's happening with that. That was also one of your agenda points. What would you like to mention about this? Yeah,
we had the, let's say, the usual information provided to the member states about the work program, so the workload for this year and a bit looking into next year. Where we will end up probably with a bit the same number of opinions like we had the year before. For active substances, very similar. For Union Authorisation, we go a bit up. And we agreed on a revised working procedure for Union Authorisation applications. We have several new tools which we are using, interact collaborations, let's say. Maybe a bit technical, but important for the industry to know. So these working procedures are now revised and will also be soon published on the website of the committee. And then also another working procedure we agreed upon, and that's related to the linguistic review of summary of product characteristics of the SPC. And that might all sound a bit technical, but it's an important document which comes out of the Union Authorisation process. Member states are checking the SPC, which needs to be translated in all languages of the EU. So we've set up a working procedure, and it has been revised, and that will also be soon published on the agency website. And maybe the last one, which might be relevant for our audience, is that we are looking at ways in fact, to make the whole process more effective and more efficient. And we started to look at the role of the applicant, so the one who's submitting the dossier for Union Authorisation or for active substance approval. Yeah, we had a document for discussion from the agency, looking at ways on how to simplify and make it more effective and efficient. Which part, already some debate at the committee from stakeholders, but also from member states. So we put that up for a written consultation. It was not for agreement, it was just for discussion. And that will for sure come back the next meeting when we are, again, looking at the role of the applicant within the peer review process.
Thanks, Erik. I think we have covered the main points of the meeting.
Sure.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for taking time after, was it 2 quite intense weeks of meetings. Now it's time for a summer break, as you mentioned in the beginning. But then we will be back again having next highlights in September.
Okay. Thank you, Päivi.
And if you want to go back and listen to our earlier episodes on the Biocidal Products Committee or listen to our other podcasts, you can find them on your favorite podcast channel.
Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.